Welcome to the Compliance Live for July. This month, my guest is Joe Burke. Joe was most recently the Chief Ethics and Compliance Officer at Quest Software. In this episode 3, Joe moves to Quest, spinning off from Dell and into the CCO chair. I know you'll enjoy this episode. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back for another episode in this month's The Compliance Live series. This month, I'm visiting with Joe Burke. So, Joe, first of all, welcome back.
Thank you, Tom.
Joe, in this episode, you move into the CCO chair. Could you tell us how that happened?
Sure. When I was at Dell, I was in the Chief Compliance Legal Chair. They called it Chief Compliance Counsel. And so I provided legal advice, really, to the Chief Compliance Officer. But even in that role, I had been acting sort of as de facto Chief Compliance Officer for a lawyer who had a lot more responsibilities than just Chief Compliance Officer. Now, of course, all of the final decisions, whether it was self-disclosure, whether it was litigation, whether it was investigation, all of that was managed by Mike McLaughlin, who was the Chief Compliance Officer. But he did give me a lot of leeway strategically and functionally in how we built the program and how we managed things. Now, when I left Dell, I left wanting to get into a role that was more of a Chief Compliance Officer role, and so I joined Quest Software. Quest Software was a spin-off from Dell that occurred just before the completion of Dell's acquisition of EMC. And what I said to the team that was recruiting for Quest was, this is a perfect opportunity in private equity for me to step into a Chief Compliance Officer role. I've got the experience for it. This is what I'd love to do. And they said, that's great, but this being private equity, we also need you to do the employment law. So, it was exactly what I wanted in terms of the Chief Compliance Officer role. And I learned a lot very quickly about how you adapt from a company as varied and as structured as Dell at the time was, a $60 billion company, stepping into a role with a company that is less than $1 billion in revenue and has none of the infrastructure, not even a code of conduct. It was a real eye-opener for me.
Really, and that's what I wanted to focus on in your professional career. You've had some major cultural shifts due to your moves, and you talked about moving from New York City to Louisville, Kentucky, then down to Austin, moving from the restaurant business, if I can call it that, into computer business. And now you're going, as you said, from a $60 billion company to a $1 billion company. Did it harken back to your early days at Dell, which were so what I perceived to be go-go, or was it a different experience for you?
There were some similarities to the go-go days of Dell. The difference, I think, really was even then at Dell, when I joined in 1996, everybody knew Michael Dell. He'd been in every newspaper around the world, and the Dell name, I owned a Dell computer. And so I think at that time, even though there was a sense of instability for the worker, it took time to develop that comfort level. Quest was a different experience. Quest, nobody knew. The name was not very familiar to anybody. The software is really fascinating software, but not the kind of stuff that you can pick up, at Target. It just was a very different environment for me to work for a company that nobody knew, whose software was security-based, sort of mid-level corporate software that nobody would ever use on their own, and they had no infrastructure. And again, I have to emphasize the point. We took the Dell Code of Conduct and a bunch of other samples out on the web and just basically created a new code of conduct from nothing for this company that didn't have a culture yet, that really was private equity sort of spinning up based on existing software and an existing team that they had pulled together from various different places, and try to create a culture and try to create an organization that can sell this software and grow this company. It was different in so many ways from Dell, who had a vision. Michael Dell, had a mission and a vision from the very beginning. He knew what he wanted to do. He knew where he wanted to be. He knew the path to get there, or at least he had his path to get there. We had none of that at the beginning of Quest just 6 years ago.
So did that make things exciting? Did that make things challenging? Did that give you a fulfillment or perhaps professional satisfaction that you not had as much at one of your other jobs?
It certainly made things exciting. I didn't know much about private equity at the time. I certainly have learned since then. We worked very closely in the early days with Francisco Partners Operations, their operating partnership. And it was really interesting to me to see how private equity builds in that infrastructure for a carve-out company like us. We made a lot of decisions very, very quickly. We put in place a lot of insurance and banking and, as I said, policy and procedural documents. And we did it at a pretty quick clip. Some good decisions, some less good decisions operationally. But we learned so much about the way our business was going to operate that when we did run into some fairly big decision making shortly after that, in the years that followed, we had people standing by our side that we could trust. We knew how decisions had gone badly in the past, and I think we were able to avoid some mistakes by hearkening back to some of the things that we tried to do in those first days. I think the experience was we grew up so fast, not necessarily as lawyers or as finance people or anything else, but as how does this culture work? What does this culture need to be successful? And we were successful in our first couple of years. We hit some pretty high targets. I think the challenge we had was not having the longevity, that tenure of time together. We had this baptism by fire in the carve out, and then we all stood together and made decisions as we went.
So, how did you create? I'm sorry. What were some of the challenges, compliance-related challenges? Was it third-party agents on the sales side? Was it vendor and supply chain? Was it establishing the culture that you wanted or you felt comfortable with, or was it another challenge?
We had two, I would say, major challenges, more related to supply chain and sales distribution than anything else. On the supply chain side, when we left Dell, and this goes all the way back to the origins of Quest, we had a fairly substantial design operation in Russia. And at the time, we were selling to the U.S. federal government. And so one of the big challenges we had was, how do we reconcile those two things? The teams that we had were well respected, very, very accomplished, very successful teams, and yet somehow we had to resolve, how do we migrate away from this concentration on that part of our business in that part of the world. So that was a challenge that we could only work through over time, and by figuring out where are the right places to have this design, how do we make this transition. That was a very difficult set of transition steps to work through, Tom, and I just have to tell you that it was only through the dedication of that leadership team in addressing the needs of those employees, wherever they might be in the world, the needs of the customers, the needs of the company itself to be able to develop this software. That was a huge supply chain issue that we had to work through quickly, and I think we did a really, really good job of that. On the flip side, we had inherited through Dell and through Quest itself prior to Dell a number of distributors that, as you know, is often the case in the compliance world. You find out you have more people that want to sell your product than you really have time to vet and sort through. That was a pretty traditional vetting exercise. I would say it's not complete today. It never is at companies like this. But those were the two big challenges that we had, was supply chain, where are we designing, and then how well do we know those people that are distributing our products? And that's where we focused our time over those years.
And could you say a few words about culture? How Did you work to establish culture? Was that really something either Quest leadership and management led, or perhaps private equity assisted in that? How did you, I would just have to suppose, create a culture literally in a new organization?
Well, fortunately for us, I think companies tend to hire to type. I've always said that, and the one great thing about Quest is that they had a history, even prior to Dell, of hiring team-oriented folks. And I know it sounds trite, but honestly, the team at Quest got along together, was more cooperative, less competitive than any place I've been. There were times in the early days at Dell where everybody was excited, everybody was having fun because everybody was making money. But it turned very competitive over time, and I think anybody that you talk to at Dell will tell you that it became very competitive. Quest was not the same way, and so there was an underlying personality of the company, I think, that people wanted to work together, people wanted to see the company move forward, but not step on each other on the way. That helped quite a bit. I would say culture was very difficult to create on top of that, because that leadership team came together in a very short period of time after the announcement of the acquisition. In fact, there had been a team being put together prior to the closing of the acquisition of the sale, and then that team was replaced by private equity just prior to finally closing the deal. So there was a little bit of consternation, I would say, among that employee population about who are these new folks coming in. It took a little while to create that culture. But again, I think the overwhelming sort of collaborative, cooperative, drive together nature of the Quest population really helped that leadership team manage through some years where, Quest is somewhat siloed, where we have a bunch of different business units who are all out there kind of doing their own thing, building their own product, selling it the best they can. To get those guys to come together really required those employees, particularly the shared services of legal, of finance, of HR, to work very closely together to apply rules, policies, and et cetera across the entire team. That helped create a collaborative culture among administration that allowed the team to move forward.
You said one word earlier that I wanted to follow up on, and it was a connection with, I believe, the private equity owners, and that word was trust. I don't think the word trust gets enough play, but I was wondering if we might end with some of your thoughts on why you think trust is so important, particularly when you're dealing with the owners of the company, such as private equity.
Yeah, again, it's something that I teach and preach extensively in my class at Fordham. The trust, again, we read about it, we see people talking about it. It is so core to what we do as compliance people. If your coworkers can't trust that they're going to be treated in an appropriate way when something goes wrong or when something goes right, you lose credibility. You lose the ability to achieve the goals that you're setting out as a compliance officer. If leadership can't trust that if they invest in this or that program or effort, there is going to be a result, there's going to be a benefit, there's going to be a protection, then you can't get the result that you want. Trust ends up being so core to everything you do. Every communication, every email that I would send out, I would have to look at it from the standpoint of, if I were on the other side receiving this, what would my impression of the legal department and of compliance be? Because I need this person, even if I'm reprimanding them, to trust me that I'm right, that I have their best interests and the company's best interests at heart, and that I'm going to be there when they need me in the future. And I have always operated that way. I have found it very valuable in the compliance area to be somebody whose word can be trusted, because at some point I am very likely to have to be on the other side of a very difficult conversation with that person. And if they don't trust me, I can't get my job done. That's the way I've always thought about that.
Well, Joe, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode. I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode where we take a look down the road and also visit with you about teaching compliance. But before we leave, Joe, if anyone wanted to follow up with you or find out more information about any of the topics you've touched on, what would be the best way for them to do so?
Best way to connect with me is through LinkedIn. That's how I'm connected to the world.
Joe, I look forward to continuing this conversation.
Thanks, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Compliance Life. I hope you will join me next week for our final episode with Joe Burke in July of 2022 on where he sees compliance going down the road. Thanks again, and we look forward to visiting with you again.